Dying in Grace. This is a program dedicated to talking about that last taboo, death. And we want to talk about death, dying, end-of-life wellness, and bring death back into the circle of life where it belongs. We have done many shows thus far, and if you'd like to see past shows, you can see them on our YouTube station, YouTube Dying in Grace. You can also go to the website dyingingrace.com to see past shows. And each week we bring a special guest with a unique aspect or story to share. And this week we're very lucky to have my guest, Andrew Jannetti from New York City. He's a choreographer, a performer, dancer himself, and a educator.
Yes.
So Andrew, would you just tell us a little bit about how death gets involved, or a little bit about you. How did you get into dance? Let's start there. Let's start with your interest in dance.
My experience with dance. Okay, so dance was a computer error when I was at Montclair State, which is where we met. I took it as a PE credit, and it just happened to be something I fell in love with. And it was a love affair from that point on. I just became more and more involved in dance and went on to do it professionally and have my own company and become a dance educator in New York City. And but the start was a computer error.
Right. So you never know how your life's going to evolve.
Absolutely.
And actually, you started late as a dancer, right? To
18,
start at 18 is, when people start as young kids.
And I was not very physical before that, so it was a lot of catching up to do.
Well, how lucky we are that you followed that error all the way through to where you are now. So when I think about dance and ballet, for instance, there's always death depicted. I think of Broadway shows like West Side Story with the choreography of the Rumble. So what's your view on how dance and death go together in terms of the culture?
Well, I think the arts can be informative in any subject, but I think specifically with death, I know that for myself, my first piece that I choreographed, which propelled me into my professional career as a choreographer, was after my father had passed away. And I had done a dance specifically for that catharsis of dealing with the issue of what that meant to me, because I had written about it, and then I wanted to put it into a physical form. And the physical form was a duet that I had created about passing on. It was actually called Passing On, and that's how I referred to it at that time. And I think using dance, specifically because it's so visceral, is a really strong way of dealing with those emotions you have when someone dies, either suddenly or expectedly, whatever it is, because you still go through the same kind of grief and mourning, and actually, in addition to the grief and mourning, there's some kind of celebratory aspect of it when you are able to express it creatively. I think,
Yeah, I think that's the thing I like about it too is it's the whole body. When we go through some kind of emotional trauma, whether we anticipate it or not, our whole body responds, and yet most of us don't use our whole body to express our emotions. So that to me is one of the beautiful things about what you've created. So I know that there's been other themes about death and dance and tributes, etc. So I think what we'd like to do is perhaps look at the videos, the montage we have of your dance performances, and then let's talk about the stories behind each one and how they impacted you, how they impacted the audience, and the people that you created them for.
That sounds great to me.
All right,
great to do
so
that.
we'll do the videotape, please. hope all of you watching those dances were as inspired and touched as I was. Each one of them was very different. We'll explore with Andrew what they are, but I wanted to encourage you, if you want to see more of Andrew's dancing, he has a website, andrewjannettianddancers.org, so if you want to see the whole thing. So you mentioned, Andrew, the very first dance you did was the dance you mentioned,
passing on.
Passing on.
Which we did not see in the video because it was done so long ago that I didn't have that digitized yet.
Right.
So, but that was the impetus for me starting my company, actually, as the first piece I presented for critical analysis by the press, and then from that point on, I started to build my dance company. But that was what started me on the career of being a choreographer after being a dancer for so many years.
Well, that's really, I don't think I knew that, and that's really such a testimony to that piece, you know, that you would be so vulnerable in that piece and be willing to have everyone look like, here I am. I mean, you can't get much more vulnerable than that.
Well, I would agree with that when you're dealing with the issue of death and your feelings about that and trying to create something that speaks to it without it being melodramatic or trying to get the essence of what that grief is or losing someone is about. That piece was specifically about where you go afterwards. You know, so that was trying to get the essence of that, you know, through movement, and it's all very abstracted.
So the second, the first piece we saw was also in tribute to your father.
Right, so that came years later. I had this idea that I wanted to recreate something that dealt with my relationship with my dad. Because grief is not something that happens once. It's something that comes in waves, and the grief also has really fond memories, and those are the memories I wanted to capture. I have a composer I worked with, he wrote the score for it. We worked together on how it would fit from one section to the other, and the dance is made up of all images that I recall as a child, and one of the biggest images was when I was a baby. They used to pick me up and dance me around the room, and I used to say to my mom, when I saw the videos of that, what are they doing? She says, well, we used to say to you cheek to cheek. I would put my cheek out like this, and my dad would pick me up. And so the start of the dance is where I do this, and I put my hand to my cheek like this as a memory of that, and then that was the impetus for the rest of the piece. That just pulled on any memories I had of being together with my dad.
And is that why the costuming was?
Yeah, that's what the costume was like. It was almost 50-ish looking, which was, or 60s looking, yeah, like in a very conservative way. Yeah.
So, because I don't really think of dancers wearing ties too often, you know, but it...
Well, it depends on the piece, like, you know, what the piece calls for, like, you know, so.
Right. So how was that different? Because it was more memory. So what I think I'm hearing you say is that your grief, you've been along in the process, and I just think losing parents, there's always grief. So I mean, no matter how much time passes, there's always something.
Absolutely. My dad, I was 26. My dad was exactly 30 years older than I. He was 56, which to me is really young.
Right.
So at 26, I had one reaction, you know, had to do with like losing someone, passing on, and then like, wow, 20 years later, to look back on what that meant and that relationship, because I didn't really grieve right away. I remember someone asked me like 3 months after my dad died, so do you miss your dad? And I totally lost it, like, because I hadn't done that at all. Because when you go into that mode of getting things done that you need to get done. So like, and then I read this thing about grief, that grief never really leaves us. It just comes back. And when we experience it, we should experience it. And it doesn't mean you're holding on. It doesn't mean you haven't let go. It just means that you have this whatever the memory, something you smell, something triggers it, and you have that memory, and the memory is so strong that that's part of the grieving process too. I think creating that dance was a catharsis, really. And it made me feel stronger about my relationship with my dad and how much I was really like him. Because when I grew up, I felt not like him at all. We were always at odds. but really I grew up in a very loving family, so I really am a lot like him, and that made me see that. And my niece saw it, and she started crying when she saw it. I said, "You made me cry, Uncle Andrew, because I never saw something so touching." And she didn't know my dad.
Right.
You know, she
But
wasn't.
she knew him through your
Absolutely.
performance.
Absolutely.
She felt like she knew.
And she knew my mother, because my
Right.
mother was her grandmother. So,
Right.
you know, so she knew my mother, and so she must have known how important that relationship was to her at the time. She was like, I think 10 or 11 when she saw it the first time.
Right. So let's talk about the second piece, which was for Kiki, and then we'll get back to your mom's death. So that was a unique and
It was unique.
And also a duet.
Right. So for Kiki was from an artist who from New York, whose wife had passed away, and he was looking for someone to create a memorial service, a dance. And someone recommended me to him. Someone who knew him, I didn't know him, but someone who knew him recommended me to him. He called me up, and I went out to visit him at his house, got all this information about his wife's artwork. She had done many different kinds of artwork, from sculpture to painting to caustic art, which is a whole thing with wax. And then we talked about the relationship, and so I built this duet based on symbols from her artwork, sculpture. It was very sculptural, so it was really easy to do that, and then how they related to each other, because they had a very long marriage and a very engaging marriage where they did lots of adventures together. So it was like a tribute to that, and he was very moved by it. Then it became part of my repertory. It was only done as a commission for that memorial, and I asked him if I could use it in the repertory, and he said yes, and he came to many performances after that every time I performed it. So.
Well, I have to say, I don't think I've ever been at a memorial service where dance was part of it. What was the reaction of the people present who were remembering their friend or their relative? What was their reaction to seeing the dance?
Well, it was done in an informal theater loft setting. There had to be over 100-something people there at the service, and his family, his sons, because they grew up with this mother and father who were artists, who had both gone to Cooper Union in the 50s, like they really are part of a scene. They understood. To them, I don't think it seemed out of the usual, and they were really actually very thankful for it, and they were impressed with how I could capture their mother and their parents' relationship within that piece. So the audience, it was a really responsive audience, I should say.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just beautiful, and it gives people ideas of nothing has to be traditional. You can create, as this gentleman did, you can create whatever you want to honor the person that you're remembering, and there's no limits to what that can be.
Right.
How lucky that, I mean, it's really quite beautiful. So now let's go back to the third piece we saw, which is Margarets Lament, and that's your mother. So tell us a little bit about that.
This was more difficult because my mom lived way past my father, and she lived to be 80, and she didn't quite make it to 80. She was almost 80, and her death was really emotional for us because she was in the hospital. We had planned to go on a trip to Italy for her 80th birthday, and she had to have surgery before, and there was complications of the surgery, that a month in the hospital from the surgery, and eventually she died from that. And in fact, and we were so angry. So I had a lot of anger about that. And me and my siblings, all had really, so it took me a number of years to separate myself from that intense anger to be able to go back. And the piece was created, it's called Margarets Lament. And a friend of mine who's an opera singer, Christina Fontanelli, had this incredible version of Ave Maria. The first time I did it, she sang it live for me. So, and it's Margaret's Lament because my mom's name is Margaret. It's not me, but it's like a lament that I feel she would have had. And at the end of the piece, I actually go through death. I die at the end of the piece. And and my image is like, because when my mom died, we were in the hospital, and we had to say, we had to make the decision at that point because she was so far gone, and they had the heart monitor going. I said, "Can you turn the heart monitor off?" They said, "No, we can't do that." And I thought, well, you're just like torturing us now. And I used that image at the end of that heartbeat that just fades away at the end of the piece, and which we didn't see in this excerpt. But that's, so to me, it was not my reaction to it as much as like how my mother must have felt when she was in this situation. I don't know what that is, but it was how I felt. I was so distraught and angry about it that this was a way for me to deal with that. And people have said that they felt it was a really personal piece when they saw it, and they thanked me for being so transparent about my emotions about it, you know. So, because if you do something like that, it could be very melodramatic, and if you don't go for it, like really go for it, it can seem trite. So you have to really go for it, where it has a powerful effect to the audience, you know. So.
Well, it would seem to me that each time you perform it, you're also reliving what you went through.
Oh,
you
yes,
know? And
for
so
sure.
just the courage to create something and again be that vulnerable. And I would say that besides people experiencing your dance and how it touches them, it's also, we do not deal with death in any way.
Absolutely.
So the idea that you would take this most personal death of your mother and portray it in a way that people can see, they're thanking you for also raising, because we've all lost our parents, or we're going to, you know, so so that's really extraordinary. So the last piece, Whisper. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Whisper, I wanted to create a piece that was about a whisper, and whispering almost in terms of like when you're losing someone. Like it's interesting that these images came back into my choreography at different points in my career, and this was really a total abstraction. That's why the costume, which is very stark, and that's why the image of the body being very visible and trying to mimic what a whisper was like, and then the sound score, which was made in the studio with 4 voices, and then Ronnie Kuzmano, who's one of the composers I worked with at the time, did some other things to it to make it the sound. And I asked my partner and my spouse at the time to write a piece of poetry, because he used to write poetry that spoke to these images, and that created this grounding of what, as I did it, brought up images of death to me as I was doing it. And some of that is in the poetry, and some of it isn't. Some of it's really these great images that depict darkness and lightness, and you know, I wanted to be on that line of being in between. So that's why it was called Whisper, and that's why the voices were whispering, and the poetry then comes out at times, and then fades into the background, and then you're watching the movement, or you're hearing the sound, and then the poetry comes back in, and that is and it was also at a time when I had started to really face the fact that there were a number of people in my life that I lost suddenly because of accident or AIDS crisis that was going on, and that piece brings me to all of those images when I do it. Like when I'm doing the piece, that's what I think of. You know, and even like losing an animal sometimes, which can be my first animal that I lost, I was devastated by, you know, because it was really hard to lose someone you've been with for 20 years,
right,
like, you know,
right.
And that is, and like there's images of cats' whispers and cats' paws, and then how you're there at the end when all you can do is just be there, and that's how the piece ends, like, you know, so.
Well, it's interesting to me too, because when I think of whispers, just the concept, I think of that a lot around death, that people whisper that, oh, he's dying, or the person, you know, the hushed voices in a room. Certainly you want a room sacred, but there's what we can't say, you know, and what we are keep secret. Whispers remind me of secrets too, and there's that.
And it's so interesting because I think about the piece, and there's like these moments where it's very wispy, and then when the sound comes in, is like this moments of this strong kind of almost angry quality, And some of the poetry is like, and I can smell the stench of my own body, like, you know, which becomes, that part of the piece is a really angry part, like, you know, and then it goes back to this like quieter, whispery part that deals with it in a very quiet way by the end, like, you know, so.
So let me just ask you this, as an educator and working with very young children, elementary school, how do you help the children deal with whatever grief or sadness they're experiencing with dance? Is that something that you integrate into the curriculum at all?
I won't say it's integrated into the curriculum, other than the fact that I encourage creativity. So if a child is creating something from the space that they're in at that moment, and I see it might be leaning toward this, then I would encourage that. I know when I was in a high school once, and there was one young girl who did a piece, and I said to her, and I knew it was about her leaving the school, like it had to do with like, and her like friendships ending, and just by the music she picked and by what she was doing, I asked her about that. So that, and I don't think she was even aware that was happening. Sometimes, especially with kids, they're not really aware in that way, but they get this outlet to be able to be expressive. I had a number of students this summer who had lost a parent, and they were in our program, and it's not just dance, but it's art and music and theater, and for them to be able to express whatever it was going on, you know, because some of them were inventing things, inventing fantasies, and those fantasies were important for them to express. Fantasies about things that didn't really happen to them, but they wanted to happen to them because of this loss that they had had. And then there was one summer we had like 8 kids that had lost both parents to AIDS, like, you know, when they were really young. So by the time they hit 8 or 9 years old, now it's impacting them.
Right.
So what are we giving them in the art world, in the dance world, to help them through that? And it may just be like giving them the chance to be free and have fun in a movement way, you know, and whether they're expressing grief or not is not necessarily as important as an outlet of the energy that may have been pent up otherwise and not knowing how to deal with it, you know.
So we are nearly out of time. So the thing I really appreciate in part of this is allowing whatever emotions are flowing us to come out in our bodies, that we can all move. Any of us, whether we're dancers or not dancers, we can let it come out of our body in a free and creative way. And some people have the talent and beauty to create what you have. So we have this book of Living Love. You might want to put the name of someone that you care about in this book. And we would like to thank TVSB for allowing us to do this wonderful show. I'd like to thank my crew, Elliot Jacobson, Michael Nicholson, and Ken Baxter. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for tuning in, for listening, and may each day of your life have you live in grace.